Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, a very clear case study as to why it is you should not be using a massage gun, or whatever else it is I happen to be calling it, anywhere near your eyes. How it is that one gene could be the key to drastically improving embryo development, giving IVF a huge jump in its efficacy and success rate. Scientists say they've built a cell from scratch, and this is technically not the first time, but it is the first successful time to this scale. An explanation as to why it is Australia's chaotic seal, the sex pest of traffic cones, continues to do so. An Antarctic volcano continues to erupt, but this time it's releasing curious substances in the form of gold crystals. And NASA is launching a daring rescue of a telescope this week. And finally, we have the Supreme Court in the United States on glyphosate, which is not a headline we thought we would ever read anywhere. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with an everyday object, a massage gun, a stupid fad that's currently going around circles. Thankfully, it is not the stupidest thing we've ever heard. But still, the idea is simply vibration therapy helps you somehow. Now, vibration also tends to get overstated, with some idiots claiming that chocolate is an octave of sun energy, but if we ignore the grossest of stupidity, we can instead look at a case study to understand why, yes, they may be helpful in certain aspects, and mostly with large muscles, using them in other places is likely to get you in a very bad place very quickly. It involves a 20-year-old man using a massage gun on and around his eyes, and thereby damaging the retinas. The bit at the back of the eyeball. You know, all the way in the back of your head, where you shouldn't have ready access with a massage gun. But apparently, this case study says the idiot managed to do so. The underlying thought is dumb, but not completely without some sort of understanding. The man thought that if he had took the massage gun near and around his eyes, it would help with the feeling of tiredness. And possibly, maybe, that might have worked. Except it was never going to work. And the reason why is very simple. Massage guns and eyeballs do not mix. Remember, the eyeball is, for all intents and purposes, a giant fluid sac. Shaking a fluid sac with vibrations is going to cause you considerable pain and discomfort. Especially if you do it for a long time, as this individual had been doing. Now, admittedly, not as frequently as you might think. It was once a week for about 3 months, so effectively 13 occasions. But the time frame for each treatment was several minutes. And what happens is very, very simple. The massage gun caused tearing and bruising in the retina.
It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up.
And to an extent, the right eye also detached from the eye wall. Now, the last of these is perhaps the most serious, as the others you can recover from. A retinal detachment? No, that leads to permanent vision loss. The case study, and for that matter, the various other instances have been showing up in medical reports, is all a matter of the device being a low-risk device. That is, the chances of somebody actually doing themselves any harm when used as intended is minimal.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got myself into this situation.
But once you start doing dumb things, the system doesn't account for that, which, to be honest, we would imagine allowing for the lowest common denominator would probably be that choice, but well, that's not how regulation works at the moment, and understandably why so. Of course, there's also the fact that most massage guns are simply rebranded and repackaged other devices, let's call them, so YouTube does not punish us. Moving on to technically related news, if we're talking about the original design for a massage gun, Ovaries are developing a second role after menopause, which honestly is not all that surprising. The ovaries don't just stop doing anything and everything once you hit menopause. They stop a role in ovulation rather obviously, as that's one of the major things that the ovaries are responsible for. but they don't stop doing anything and everything. They are still a hormone-producing organ.
None of my clothes fit and I'm breaking out. I am not going to school. Got another sit. I'm gonna live under a troll bridge. I'm a flower girl and I want special shoes. Pink, bows and lights and music. Everyone shut your breakfast.
So this brings us to what's going on with them after you cease being of a, let's say, reproductive age. If you look at 28 women, and that is a significant issue, it's a smallish study, the effects of ovaries, or the, let's say, function of ovaries after menopause doesn't cease, but also most of this is backed up in mouse studies to some extent, so if you assume that humans are like rodents, and very much not the case, for different reasons than you might think, the reality is that the effects last well into your older age, and probably, maybe, don't ever actually stop. So, first of all, you have a sharp decrease in estrogen, but not a complete cessation of estrogen production. So menopause doesn't completely stop it, which is one reason why women can still benefit from extra estrogen from, say, estrogen implants for osteoporosis. But other than that, they also provide benefits in certain other functions. For example, although fewer follicles are present, and there's a lot of collagen in other cell tissues that indicate damage, they do still have a function to play in, let's say, T cells, macrophages, and multinucleated giant cells. That would indicate that somehow the ovaries then pick up, let's say, some of the work that other organs may not be doing as well for older women, and this may explain to a certain extent why women survive longer than men, in a immunological role. That is, they're acting like a inflammatory organ. Now, this is also worth noting that although most of the research is based on rodents, there is some human research to support it. It's still fairly, if not very much so, preliminary. So just be aware that although we say this, there is, let's call it, a finite evidence to indicate what's going on. In further reproduction-related news, a gene that would be stopping human embryos from forming properly, and claims from a study that this is the case. The idea that we could claim that any one gene is responsible for this seems to be very optimistic, and we are wondering about whether or not this is based purely on every other gene working as intended, or perhaps some other confounding variable. But even if we were to find that this research is true and correct, it's only really been established for mice. And again, rodents don't always translate to humans when we talk about research, so even if it is true, that doesn't necessarily help us in the least. So what we have here is a gene called NANOG, and what it does is it helps to form the embryo, and specifically producing what is basically a yolk sac. That is the yellow part of your egg, if you're looking at, say, a chicken egg. And that is important as it's essential to support the initial cells as they start building up to create, well, a new organism, typically speaking. What this gene does, and why it would understandably be important in what's going on, is that it is a transcription factor. That means what it does is take bits of DNA and helps to translate them into protein, coordinating everything that's going on in the cell. Now, it would make sense that if you have no coordination and anything and everything is going anywhere, think of, say, a bunch of children playing, an Amazon factory or warehouse, things like this. You would understand how and why it is that, well, coordination isn't exactly going to work, and why you need some sort of management, coordinator, in this case, transcription factor. Now, what brings us to the questioning all of this, let's call it, is that although they were looking at real human embryos, and this does help somewhat to support the claim that the NANOG gene does play a big role, it doesn't necessarily work the same way in humans as it does in mice. And that is the big issue here.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
First of all, they were working on the premise of a knockout, or knockdown. That is, you take a gene and you completely stop it from functioning as intended inside of the organism, or whatever it is you're working with, say for example cell culture. So they relied on the idea of being able to take out the gene in its entirety, which could be relevant, but it could also mean that this is one part of a larger process and you need this gene along with several others in a, let's say, cluster, a sequence or similar, because they support each other and allow for their combined function. Similar to the idea of removing one card from a house of cards. Theoretically, the entire thing will collapse, but also theoretically, a part of that house may still stand because the other cards provide enough support, let's call it. There is also the more realistic problem that a knockout method, let's call it, can and nearly always do have some off-target effects. As a consequence, you may also have a, let's say, a collateral damage to other genes that are then causing this same phenomena to occur. This is where the human research element is particularly important. Although taking down the NAOG gene in human embryos that were otherwise normal, natural, perfectly functional, let's call it, the embryo is still developing the yolk sac and placental cells. What they weren't doing was directing as many, if not most, resources into development of the actual, eventually, what would become a blast, the cells that would form an actual embryo eventually. So it would be clear from this that the rodent-based and human-based research definitely have massive gaps between how they overlap. Now, this is not to say that it's not relevant, just that, as stated, it's probably not the sole and complete explanation. Going on to similar related news, we have a long life and why it is that living for a long time might actually come with a surprising amount of cost. Just consider this. Humans are arguably one of the longest living animal species. By no means are we the longest living. There are some that live significantly longer, for example, giant turtles. Even if we ignore these outliers, humans are quite to the extreme end of a long-lived species, and so it raises a fairly significant question. Why is it that humans as a species were essentially pressured, let's call it, to live that long? And the answer to that question may actually be in our genetics, and more importantly, it may actually be something more serious going much further back in our evolution, and that has continued to haunt us to today. Similar to how plague haunts humans as a species, the children haunt parents, and study and medical debt haunts everybody to some extent. The reality is that the longer we live, the less healthy we become, and that is an inevitable outcome. But you would think, well, surely the longer you live, you should have all the damage done. You shouldn't just keep building up these problems, and no, humans are like that, and that's odd, at least compared to other species.
Look, there's been a terrible mistake. I'm a human being, see? I'm all squishy and flabby. Also, I complain a lot.
Yes, you do. You need to relax more.
Wow!
Terrific. Now consider the following. You were admitted to this robot asylum. Therefore, you must be a robot. Diagnosis complete.
I do other human stuff. I age, see?
This is where what has been described as a shadow comes into play. The idea is simple. Once you reach that time frame, that age, where you're considered elderly or old, you are no longer passing on genes to new members of the species. No more progeny, no more children, at least assuming you're not Hugh Hefner, in which case there's a decent chance you may have a chance of continuing to procreate. But for the average human, no. This is why any genes that would show up when you're that old are just going to show up regardless. That is the shadow. But when you're at a reproductive age to actually have children, you seem otherwise perfectly healthy, at least at a genetic level. And so you only really know about these problems, at least in terms of evolutionary pressure, after nothing can be done about it. Or at least, as far as we're aware, abortion isn't an option once children are born.
Poor little guy. He's been sick for so long, and I feel so badly for him. Little buddy is in so much pain. I'm afraid the only option we have left is, you know...
Miss Livingston, this is an adult human being inside of an animal costume.
Your best option is only to, ideally, be able to somehow or other adopt them out, but even that's much harder than it sounds. Even if we talk about those young people anyway, the reality is that genes that might help when you are younger could prove significantly more damaging and more of a problem when you're older. So again, evolution provides a double-edged sword in respect of selecting for those individuals. Sure, it may help you run faster, get food, escape predators, or fight off enemies, or even reproduce. But it could also mean that once you get to an older age, it increases your risk of, say, heart disease, a risk of falls, bone damage, or just becoming a more delicious snack for whatever predator can now catch you. Going on now, we have scientists claiming to have successfully created a cell from scratch. That is to say, a cell from completely nothing. Now, as I've mentioned before, technically not true. There have been previous successful examples of synthetic, that is artificial DNA not made from the normal nucleotides, being able to sort of create a living organism. The difference between that and this example is that this example could theoretically continue to live without any issue. The synthetic organism didn't really have that option. It essentially began to fail after a period of time just due to the nature of it being effectively a prototype, a proof of concept. We couldn't even really call it a prototype. Now, what makes this particularly important is that by being able to, let's say, piece together a cell or organism from everything being customized, that is, building it from the ground up, you can remove absolutely everything that is unneeded, which they have to an extent done with other organisms, for example, the yeast project, the synthetic yeast 2.0 project. But again, that relied on taking a real living yeast cell and knocking out anything and everything not needed, essentially making it so that you had the bare bones of the absolutely minimal essential required things. It would no doubt spark joy. By contrast, this is essentially taking the opposite approach of what is the minimum we need to put into this to make it viable. And that's the key thing here. It's telling you the, essentially, but not quite, what is the minimum viable gene sequence or gene code needed to ensure a cell will work. And by doing that, they're able to effectively create a cell so streamlined, so practical, so functional, that you can get away with a lot of things you otherwise can't when you start adding in new genes that are superfluous to a basic survivability. Now, we should be clear about it. This cell has some of the same constraints as the previous attempts to create what is effectively a synthetic cell. Its longevity is limited, and by limited we mean it has a finite number of generations it can survive. This is true of all cells, but this is significantly more of a concern at just 5 generations before it effectively becomes completely non-viable. But at the same time, it's also incredibly, let's say, effective. By comparison to other, let's say, real cells that have arguably thousands, if not millions, of possible molecules and perturbations on everything going inside of it, this is down to somewhere between 150 to 200. So it's very, very simple. If we were to be very, very optimistic about what's happened here, we could say that this is almost, but not exactly, like the earliest example of life on Earth. That is, it's an incredibly tiny, tiny genome, about 90,000 base pairs versus arguably about 1 million or there-ish for some of the more basic organisms on Earth that have a full genome that are naturally derived, versus those that are semi-synthetic or completely synthetic but also non-viable. Going on to sort of life-related news, although strictly speaking not, Ebola, and the first case outside of Africa in 2026.
Bart, would you like to read a book?
An Air France flight has managed to carry Ebola out of Africa and into the rest of the world at long last. Thankfully, it's only gone to Paris.
And this is my universal translator. Unfortunately, so far it only translates into an incomprehensible dead language.
Hello.
Bonjour.
Which we're not so worried about. The white French flag has not been flown, so we can only assume they haven't given in to it, which given any time France is put under any stress is what we'd expect to see. Okay, we are being a little facetious about most of that, but it is true. Ebola has arrived in France. And this is not great. It's worth noting that it's not the first time Ebola has arrived in France, it's just the current Ebola outbreak has obviously caused this, and fortunately the patient was immediately isolated and taken into care, so the chances of it spreading are very low. It's also helpful that the individual was in a stable condition and they had a very low viral load, meaning the chances were already kind of slim, but this is a situation in which better safe than sorry, because sorry involves an outbreak of a relatively deadly disease. And there's also the fact that there was an airplane full of individuals who may have also been infected, so now you have to track them and make sure that they weren't actually infected. The irony of this whole situation is actually not to be understated though. The individual returning to France was a doctor from the Alliance for International Medical Action, who was presumably in Africa trying to provide humanitarian assistance to those who have Ebola, only to then be infected with Ebola. If they had managed to spread it to France and cause another outbreak, the irony would have been absolutely peak at that point. Going on now, we have animal news, and a scientific explanation as to why Neil the seal, Australia's popular, celebrity, notorious seal, who has a thing for traffic cones, may actually be attacking traffic cones and possibly molesting them. Apparently, it's all down to the nature of what they are, and how traffic cones are, let's say, responded to by seals. The reality is that let's be blunt about this. The interest by Neil the seal is based on him thinking, wow, what is this weird thing? And what it is that apparently he thinks, well, I want to explore what this thing is, and I don't like it once he looks into it, and once he looks into it and goes, I don't like this, the obvious solution is to make it go away. Unfortunately, in the process of exploring it to find out whether or not he's interested in what this strange new object is, well, once you have something that massive pushing on what is essentially a reasonably soft and pliable, plasticky, rubbery thing, you no longer have to worry about the rubbery, plasticky thing existing, it's being crushed. Once, however, Neil the seal had established that, hey, this thing is at least somewhat stable-ish for a time, it helps him to shed, and that's another reason why he's doing it. He's rubbing his face against the cones, partially to try and, again, remove that excess skin, essentially exfoliating. And by exfoliating this way, and given that he can be up to a ton in weight, you don't have a very long-lasting cone. And this is why Neil the seal is particularly fond of traffic cones, and possibly, once he is fully grown, traffic cones may not be enough. In further animal-related news, but this time going to the other side of the world, figuratively and literally, YellowStone, and the wolves that were reintroduced to help to control various populations of animals that they would predate upon, and the claims that perhaps reintroducing the wolves have been overstated in terms of benefits.
Hey man, just a heads up. Instead of howling at the moon tonight, we're all gonna yell, cock-a-doodle-doo!
Really? That seems weird.
I'm just trying to make sure you don't look silly.
Cock-a-doodle-doo!
What an idiot! He actually believed me!
That's what a rooster says, not a wolf!
Understand, wolves were removed for kind of obvious reasons, at least in terms of people. That is, they are a viable threat to human populations and animals you want to keep. Domesticated sheep, cows, whatever it is you happen to be wanting to grow up that end of America, and...
Wolf! Wolf! Did you hear that? Somebody needs help!
Let's go!
Well, that's all well and good, except once you remove wolves from the natural food chain, suddenly there's a whole bunch of animals that you don't have control over, and they explode in population. So the solution was, okay, well, if we don't want to go to the effort of trying to control them ourselves, let's reintroduce wolves and see what happens. And it appears to have worked, or at least that was the thought. The claim now is that it may have been overstated. Now, we would argue that even if it is overstated as such, well, that's still not a massive loss. It's a much more efficient method of controlling the population of animals in the Yellowstone Park than it is to simply try and have foresters, government officials or agents, even hunters go out there and try and control the populations themselves. It's just plain silly to use that option when you have a perfectly viable animal that could do the job for you. The issue here is that the initial claims of success were based on a study that was conducted 30 years after the wolves were introduced, and it was basically taking aspen tree populations, both new emerging trees and older established trees, and seeing sort of ratios, numbers, etc. And the new study is claiming, well, yes, okay, you've done that, but methodologically, that's flawed. And if you interpret the data the way you have, it is also flawed, which is essentially how peer review works. So it's not terrible, exactly, but even with that in mind, it's still a reasonable response. Now, the other issue here is that the terms of the method, okay, that's alright, we can see how you would argue methods, but the interpretive side of this is where it gets to be interesting. The initial claim was that there's about a 150-fold increase in aspen sapling density. By contrast, the new study, let's say, claims that it's actually only about a 17.5-fold increase. So that's about 1/8 or thereabouts of the difference. So if you are operating on a 12.5% value of what was previously thought to be 100%, that does drastically alter the significance. It doesn't mean things aren't working, because to be clear about it, demonstrably it is successful. But it does mean that perhaps the metrics that you're assuming apply may not necessarily apply the way they're supposed to be. This could, possibly, maybe, also just be a spat between academics who want to throw mud at each other and see how much they can embarrass the other, but that's not clear based on the published research. Going to other news now, we shift to again the other end of the world, about Antarctica, and the fact that Antarctica has a volcano that is throwing gold crystals into the atmosphere. And sadly, no, there is no way for you to be able to collect these, as realistically both the size and location of these crystals makes it nigh on impossible. On Ross Island in the Ross Sea, a deep bay in Antarctica, Mount Erebus is throwing up microscopic gold crystals, which is going to drastically alter any kind of cost-benefit analysis if you were thinking, wow, maybe we can try and go there and collect gold and this would be much easier. Also, it's worth noting that only about 80 grams or just under 3 ounces of microscopic gold dust per day are released, which, to be clear about it, even in many cases where you are talking about very, very, let's say, accessible and relatively rich sources of gold, they still aren't producing quite as much, but you also need to find a way to catch, isolate, and refine this gold from what is essentially ash. So the chances of it being effective are very, very limited. What makes it unique, though, is the fact that it is throwing forth crystal gold in terms of elemental gold. And that raises weird questions about how. Obviously, how is kind of important, because gold in volcanic emissions, although not unusual, how rich this is what gets to be curious. The reason, or at least underlying mechanism, is reasonably clear. Gold just doesn't get hot enough to melt properly inside of a volcano, at least by comparison to some other metals that you might find in there. But they don't also tend to melt anywhere near as much as you might think. This would explain why you often find a literal elemental metal inside of volcanic eruptions and the clouds thereof. All we are waiting for now is to see whether or not it can turn the area around the volcano into a literal blanket of gold, although given how little gold is actually being reduced or released on a daily basis, you might find that this takes significantly longer than thought, at least at the moment. Going on now, we have nuclear power, and how it is that nuclear power stations and the glow from them is detected in water 150 miles away. Now, for those using civilized numbers, the translation would be approximately 240 kilometers, but America and Canada in this case, although we'll get to that later, the research is able to detect particles known as antineutrinos, which are fired from a nuclear reactor, that was being traveled or able to travel 240 kilometers, and this breakthrough finding, yes, let's call it that, is the first time water alone has been used to detect them. And what they're doing is detecting the distant reactor using the water as a way to, let's say, act as a sort of a monitoring device, roughly speaking anyway. Theoretically, if the water works as described and can be scaled up or repeated elsewhere, it would provide a new generation of cheaper, safer detection technology for anything around nuclear energy particularly. The whole thing here is that neutrinos are what they're looking into, and neutrinos are weird. They theoretically will provide massive insight into the universe, but antineutrinos? Yeah, okay, they're the opposite side of this. So you need to find a way to detect the neutrino before you can worry about the antineutrino, and they're a problem because they're massless, have no charge, and have practically no interaction with reality. They basically just sort of pass through everything like a ghost. Now, they're also known as ghost particles for that reason. Antineutrinos are, as mentioned, the flip side to this, the counterpart, the antiparticle, the Sith to the, in this case, Jedi, we guess. And because they also have opposite charge, the equivalent thereof, they're practically non-existent, but they have a slight negative charge in terms of electrons, and so on, they really can only barely be detected at the best of times, and that's just because they have so little to them. That's why the nuclear reaction process is so easily detected this way though. The process of beta decay, which is part of what's going on inside of a nuclear reactor, ends up producing certain products. First you get the production of a proton, an electron, and an antineutrino. Then this antineutrino is able to interact with a proton, and it produces a positron, a neutron, in the process of beta decay, or more accurately, inverse beta decay. And that's key here, as what they're doing is able to detect that reaction, rather than just trying to find the antineutrino itself. Now, having touched on the what they found, it's the how it was found that is particularly interesting. The SNO Plus facility, which is a Canadian research facility that's deep underground, protected by rock, and intended to be effectively immune to cosmic radiation and rays that would otherwise distort results, has a 780-ton spherical tank. This tank was, and has been previously filled with alkyl benzene, that was intended to amplify light. While undergoing calibration, said tank was filled with ultra-pure water, and this appeared to be particularly important as that ultra-pure water had nearly twice the efficacy in terms of detecting what's going on in the universe. Now, admittedly, they only had 190 days worth of data, as obviously the tank was refilled, and they eventually figured out, hey, actually, this data is kind of important and helpful, but even if you consider that, there's still a decent chance that they may refill with water once more when they figure out what they're going to do with a massive amount of alkyl benzene. But that's essentially how they've discovered this weird phenomena and detected radiation results from somewhere so far away. Admittedly, how much use this is perhaps not clear yet, but one day. Going on now, we have NASA trying to rescue a telescope with a daring launch. What's happening is that a telescope is falling back to Earth, and what they want to do is stop that from happening using a service robot. And thankfully, no, you don't require plucky oil rig workers or anything else. This is just a robot. Well, just is a very unkind way of describing it. What's going on is that Hubble Space Telescope is going to have its life extended by shifting it just a little bit further out of the way so that it will no longer crash to Earth and prospectively be destroyed, which would be a shame, as although Hubble is no longer the be-all and end-all of space telescopes, it is still incredibly powerful, incredibly valuable, and still functioning for the most part. To be clear, NASA is no longer actively trying to replace or maintain it with new components and similar. What they are trying to do is simply keep it working for as long as they can with the minimum amount of effort, which we presume a space launch and an emergency rescue is technically minimum of effort. in effect, what happens with Hubble and the position it is in essentially Earth's atmosphere, although technically in space, is that much like a ship with a hole in its hull below the waterline, is that it gradually sinks. Now, how long it will last for will vary drastically. Obviously, the more drag on it and the bigger the hole in the case of an actual ship, the faster it sinks. But if you can somehow or other, say, bail out the water or shift it to somewhere where it's in a better position, you can get it out of that drag and minimize the amount of loss over time. But the bigger the hole, or in this case, the more drag from Earth's atmosphere, the faster the loss. And in this case, Hubble is in that position. It is sinking, and it is getting increasingly fast in the way it's sinking into Earth's atmosphere. Once it gets to a certain point, there is no rescue to be had. This is where NASA has contracted Catalyst Space, and they're going to spend $30 million doing so, but by comparison to both the scientific benefit of Hubble and the cost of anything else they could possibly try and do, and everything else considered, this is actually probably a reasonably cost-effective option. They'll take a robot that will not just capture the space telescope, but they're aiming to raise it over the course of several months, essentially gradually pushing it further and further out into space. This will in turn do two things. One, it will keep Hubble operational for as long as humanly possible, or at least as long as practically possible. But two, this is a sort of dry run, a less dry and more practical run, at actually rescuing something in space and helping with future potential problems. Possibly, maybe. Going on now, we have an interesting encounter with kind of stupid. More NASA-related stupid, but still stupid. An argument that there are two kinds of countries, those who use the metric system and those who have landed on the moon. Now, the problem here is that NASA officially uses the metric system. And we've very much tried to explain this to an individual who's absolutely adamant that America is both a imperial unit country, or customary unit, or whatever you wish to call it. Freedom units is our preference simply because freedom is, well, about as appropriate as it gets, but also appropriately stupid, and that NASA actually does do this, and the individual in question seems to be incapable of understanding that, no, NASA is actually a organization that relies on metric units. Technically they use the System International, but it's worth noting that the System International uses metric, which is a subset, and while it's true that they have previously used imperial units, the use of those units was only in specific contexts and ways, and primarily to translate what would otherwise be metric units into imperial units so astronauts on board could more readily and easily understand what they were seeing. Not so that they could go, oh yeah, this is what we're dealing with or seeing. Now, why we find this particularly funny is several-fold. One, the question of what country is NASA in? America. But also, America agreed to use metric in 1878. They signed the Meter Treaty, or as it's also more commonly known, the Metric Treaty. And what is important here is that they also further reinforce this with making it a national standard effectively at a government level that, where possible, and in all ways possible, metric should be used. Now, it is important to note that some of these changes came much later, about 1991 in some instances, but it does mean that at least since 1878, possibly a little bit earlier, a little bit later, depending on exactly how you look at the implications and implementation of the treaty, it could be anywhere between 1875 and 1891, but still, they were and are a metric country. Now, the other thing here is that the individual in question struggles with one fundamental issue here. NASA has lost multiple massive projects as a result of the mixture of imperial and metric units. You have the Mars rover that was trying to transmit data in imperial format to a metric system, and that incompatibility in data led to the Mars lander, and would have later been various other things, being destroyed. And then you have the fact that NASA specifically tells vendors, we will give preference to anybody making parts in the format of metric. there have been multiple companies that have had issues with trying to make parts to fit older systems that were built using Imperial measurements because they were domestically manufactured, because most domestic companies in America still use Imperial units, and so converting a metric part to try and be Imperial has proven to be incredibly difficult, and oftentimes they've had to completely scrap whatever they were using and try and rebuild things from the ground up to match that. Next, and this is the funniest part of all, for us at least, is that the USA is clearly using Imperial and metric in all regards. They have this weird hybrid system. That hybrid system is a disaster. NASA has clearly said, no, we use metric, preferable in all cases, and there's very little reason not to do so. And the response to that is being fancy words or fine words, and America is a country that doesn't use metric. No. Just know that the response is that America is the only ones to have landed anyone on the moon is true, but they did not land them on the moon relying on Imperial units. So, no. Sometimes we wonder about people and their inability to apply the basic rationale of, hey, maybe I'm wrong and can I reflect on this? Which kinda sucks. The final court case we have is an interesting, we want to call it a debacle, but it's not quite, it's messy. It's the Monsanto versus Donnell case, and the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States of America has issued a decision on this. In fact, it's a decision that may have significant and extensive ramifications. It's also curious that the decision only took a month to be made, so we'll see what happens, but in short, Monsanto v. Donnell, or and Donnell, depending on how you wish to read it, and technically it is and Donnell, it's a weird legal thing, is that Monsanto was sued. They were basically sued on the premise of, hey, Roundup, glyphosate, whatever you wish to call it, that causes cancer. Now, there is practically no scientific evidence that glyphosate causes cancer, but there is a lot of very compelling emotional arguments. And in result of this, essentially there was a decision that, hey, you've actually caused harm because you've caused cancer. Even though we can't prove you've caused cancer, you've caused cancer. So pay these individuals and everybody else who's now suing massive amounts of money. This was inevitably appealed, but importantly, at a state level, the law was kind of on the side of the plaintiffs. That is there a somewhat better than not chance that you have caused this? And it's the difference between a civil case and a criminal case, where criminal, it has to basically be overwhelming and almost complete evidence. With civil, it's just better than not. So is there a 51% chance that it caused it? And if you have an emotional argument, well, you can see how that happens.
We are really trying to understand this. How is it that you boys think referring to gay people as fags in today's world is acceptable?
Because we're not referring to gay people. You can be gay and not be a fag. Yeah, a lot of fags aren't gay.
I happen to be gay, boys. Do you think I'm a fag?
Do you ride a big loud Harley and go up and down the streets ruining everyone's nice time?
No.
Then you're not a fag.
Eventually, though, we get to SCOTUS. Now, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States of America...
I don't know about this.
Hey, we all did it. If you want to be a Supreme Court justice, you gotta pick up that cherry with your butt cheeks and drop it in that beer.
Come on, dude.
Essentially turned around and said, well, no, this entire case is premised on a fundamental issue, that you're claiming that a state-level decision, effectively, has a right to overturn a federal agency and a federally decided subject matter, and you don't get to do that. That means the entire case now gets scuttled, because SCOTUS has said, yeah, okay, well, you might have won it with a state case, but the state case doesn't get to override federal law or federal agencies. And this is where the EPA comes in. The EPA has said that there is no evidence to support the case itself, because we found no evidence, at least nothing reliable, to say that glyphosate causes cancer. So you can't really make this call. You can't say it does when we've established at a federal level that no, it doesn't. Now, this was by no means a, let's call it a conclusive case, as there was obviously dissent, but it was a 7-2 decision. What gets particularly interesting from this, not just the fact that it was a split decision, but it's who supported it, or who was essentially in the majority, and who dissented. Jackson and Gorsuch were the dissenting voices, whereas Kavanaugh, Roberts, Thomas, Alito, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Barrett were in the majority and concurred with by Thomas. That sort of means that you had the majority just outright saying that, yeah, no, this is right. Thomas saying, yes, I agree, but I agree with most of this, or overall agree with it, but I have a different take in this way, or perhaps I disagree with this element of it. And Jackson and Gorsuch basically saying, no, you are wrong. The problem with that is that you have a very mixed, at least politically, landscape in terms of this, and that's where things get interesting. The argument is often that, oh, you get appointed for life by whatever party, Democrats or Republicans, and you tend to vote and your decisions aligned with that, but this is not the case. This is clearly the case that there is definitely a less political aligned thing to this, and more a case of, is there an actual factual basis for this, or as we've established, there is an emotional basis, and the lack of a factual basis is the problem. What we find interesting is that even though they've won this case, Monsanto, and strictly speaking Bayer, as they brought out Monsanto, has still stated they intend to complete the planned $10 billion settlement fund, which would somewhat indicate that either one of two things. Either they're looking at this and going, it's just going to cost us way more and it's going to be way worse for public relations to dick around with this, or possibly, and more likely, they're just looking at this and going, look, we make enough money, we can do that, and this just goes away and we don't have to hear about it again. Or we could possibly try and fight all these cases and make them go away. But yes, it's based on this alone, it would appear that the whole claim is essentially moot from here on. Any of the other ongoing cases will be scuttled by it, because the SCOTUS has just said no, which means every other state will now have to follow suit. But it also, to an extent, undermines the IARC's position, understandably so. IARC is one of two agencies in the UN responsible for cancer. One is IARC, the other is a similar agency that essentially establishes between the two of them, is there hazard and is there risk? Now, a hazard is anything that could possibly cause you harm. For example, a hazard could be, say, a shark in the water at a beach. But the risk of that shark causing you harm, if you are on the actual shore itself, that is, if you are on land, is practically negligible, unless you get a sharknado, in which case, well, too bad. But if you happen to enter the water while the shark is there, that hazard now has a risk associated with it, because that risk is now notable and significant. And that's the issue. IARC establishes that there may be, for example, some sort of risk from exposure, but they don't establish hazard. And without hazard, you can't say for sure. And therein lies the problem. IARC oversteps its bounds. And of course, this could also have significant effects on another piece of legislation, but a different state entirely. That is California. And California's stupid, this is known to cause cancer in the state of California sticker. We have a whole video dedicated to that, but that same sticker may now actually need to be removed, or whatever other labeling you happen to have, for effectively failing this same decision. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.